Hi, I'm Stefania Barca, and this is my video recorded talk for the remote lecture series on climate and environmental justice of the University of California at Santa Barbara. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for this great idea of a nearly carbon neutral conference and for giving me the opportunity of being part of it. My talk is about environmental justice in working class communities, with a focus on mono-industrial towns and deindustrialized areas, which I consider a striking example of structural environmental inequality. In my research on the environmental history of Italy in the post-World War II era, I have found that unprecedented economic growth has been accompanied by enormous social and environmental costs, which are typically unaccounted for and hidden by the mainstream narrative. My primary research interest lay in breaking the silence and making visible the environmental injustice suffered by a number of sacrificed areas and disposable bodies that have sustained the growth of industrial economies in the post-war era. I call this approach telling the right story by a project of narrative justice. My research so far has led me to identify a specific aspect of environmental justice, which I call working class ecology or working class community ecology. This describes the web of material and symbolic interdependencies that connect a working class community with its biophysical environment, so the place where they live, work, and play. Working class ecology shares with environmental justice a focus on environmental concerns that arise from the material conditions of life of subaltern, marginalized, racialized people. To this, working class ecology adds a special consideration for the extent to which environmental injustice is related to work and to working conditions. In other words, rather than postulating an innate separation and opposition between the standpoints of workers and communities, working class ecology considers them as organically related, insofar as workers are also members of the communities affected by disproportionate toxicity or other burdens deriving from the hazards of industrial production, be it manufacturing, farming, infrastructures, mining, constructions, or any production-related activity with a localized environmental impact. Working class ecology assumes that workers are, like any other living being, ecological subjects in the obvious sense that they need to breathe clean air, drink clean water, eat safe food, and protect themselves from the environmental hazards. Unlike other living beings, however, industrial workers are also exposed to the hazards of production which come from their jobs. Moreover, workers are usually members of larger communities, made of their family and kin, friends and neighbors, and including people who are structurally more vulnerable to industrial hazards, such as children or the elderly, the sick, disabled people. Also, they are members of ecological communities. The biophysical environment, the air, the soil, and the water, which they share with other people and with non-human life, and that supports their reproduction. All this, I argue, makes industrial workers subject to an unsustainable contradiction, which they embody physically and mentally. The contradiction between their role in the social division of labor, that of producers and breadwinners, and their relational being, which makes them embedded in social and ecological communities that are typically harmed by industrial production. It is this contradiction between production and reproduction, work and life, that characterizes working class ecology. Environmental injustice in working class communities can be generally ascribed to economic dependency, or more specifically, to the jobs blackmail. All industrial workers, and especially those in the most hazardous jobs, know what the job blackmail is. There is no need to explain it to them. It is middle-class people, those whose income does not depend on some dirty job, who need to keep in mind that industrial society is built upon the creation of a number of sacrifice areas where concentrated pollution and risk are tolerated in the interest of the economy. Local communities must accept this state of affairs. There is not much choice left for them, but this injustice is typically sold to them as development. Working class communities do struggle to defend their rights to a safe and healthy environment, but they are often told that their job is not compatible with pollution control and regulation, so they must accept the risk or lose their job. My thesis is that the job blackmail should be understood as an effect of deeper historical patterns, two of which seem to me the most relevant. First is the capitalist regime, with its racial and colonial division of labor, which accumulates and expands by creating spatial inequalities and territorial difference. Second is the patriarchal regime, or the sexual division of labor. This has given men the role of breadwinners who need to sacrifice for their family's livelihood, and women the role of reproducers and caregivers whose work is devalued and subordinated to that of men. Both historical patterns are deep structural causes of environmental inequality, but the second, I believe, has a truly foundational role in it because it subordinates people's and ecosystems' well-being to the imperatives of industrial production, forcing working class communities to bear the social costs of pollution and toxicity. As feminist political economy has long demonstrated, the patriarchal regime is functional to the capitalist regime insofar as it creates cheap labor, which is essential to the reproduction of the workforce. Material ecofeminists have added to the equation the claim that the happy marriage between patriarchy and capitalism is also the fundamental cause of ecological crisis, because it makes sure that human and non-human reproduction are socially undervalued and subordinated to production, or what is commonly understood as the economy. This general tendency of capitalist ecology is particularly true, I argue, in working class communities, for two reasons. The first is that working class women tend to be either excluded from the formal job market or to get jobs that are more precarious with lower wages and that do not allow to support families, which means they do not represent a real alternative to their dirty industrial jobs. The second reason is that even when working outside the home, women continue to do most of the domestic work as well, caring for the children, the elderly, the sick, and the husbands. Working class women are thus doubly affected by environmental and social injustice, and in fact, they are very often the ones rebelling and mobilizing against it. In other words, the sexual division of labor implies that production and waged work must be considered as more important than the typically unwaged or low-wage work of reproduction and care. This means that care and reproduction work, and in short, life itself, have lesser value in society than commodity production. This, I argue, is the very heart of the system, the hidden abode where job blackmail and thus environmental injustice get normalized and become inescapable. So, summing up, in working class communities, both working and living environments are governed by the job blackmail, which rests on inequalities, racial, colonial, sexual division of labor, and ecological contradictions, particularly productivity versus reproductivity. By investigating a number of these working class ecologies in different contexts, I have come to the conclusion that these material conditions are not simply and passively accepted by people. Rather, they tend to yield particular forms of ecological consciousness, which is distinct from middle class ecological consciousness insofar as it is developed at the bottom of environmental and social inequality. Consequently, working-class ecological consciousness generates forms of environmentalism or environmental mobilization that are driven by material concerns with the living and working environments of working-class people, especially when these are also racialized, dispossessed, marginalized, and oppressed people. This is the terrain where working-class environmentalism is grounded. I define working-class environmentalism as that particular form of environmental justice mobilization which forms at the intersection of labor and community struggles for reproduction on the local scale. In my empirical research on working-class ecology in the south of Italy, I have found that working-class environmentalism is a powerful lever for people to question the colonial and sexual divisions of labor, break the job blackmail, and claim a structural rethinking of the local economy. The most striking example of this is the case of the city of Taranto in Apulia. It is to this particular case that the rest of my talk will now turn. Taranto is home to the biggest steel plant in Europe, named Ilva. Built in the 1960s and progressively expanded throughout the years, it now employs about 20,000 people. The emissions and waste it produces are now officially recognized as the cause of a widespread public health crisis and serious damage to the local ecosystem, including fisheries and agriculture. In short, 6 decades of Ilva have eliminated the possibility for any alternative form of economic livelihood, determining a situation of material and mental dependency, what the locals now call the steel monoculture. Taranto people are thus struggling with many problems at the same time. The high likelihood of getting cancer or having their children sickened, the lack of adequate healthcare infrastructures, which forces them to spend all their savings in seeking for help far from home, the lack of alternative job opportunities, the insistence of the Italian state with keeping Ilva in operation, going against judicial sentences that have repeatedly asked for its immediate closure and cleanup. Ilva workers have always been aware of the risks of the job, but they have paid the highest price to the situation, not only in terms of occupational cancer incidents, but also in workplace accidents. What has allowed them to speak up for themselves, to break the social acceptance of the job blackmail, has been the judicial inquiry that has led to a court sentence against Ilva in 2012. The sentence resulted from a long-standing work of collecting evidence and raising awareness on the part of a variety of individuals and groups, including environmental local groups, women's groups, public health professionals and researchers, and Ilva workers. A key element has been the official recognition of an abnormal and truly worrisome incidence of cancer in children due to the high dioxin and heavy metals contamination of the local environment. All this has made it clear that the people of Taranto are victims of an unacceptable injustice, and make them aware that they have a right to ask for the state to recognize and repair the damage, allow them to exit the steel monoculture, and open new possibilities for the local economy. In short, Taranto is not asking for assistance, but struggling for justice and liberation. I have written about the story of Taranto in 2 papers, co-authored with Emanuele Leonardi. The first is called Working Class Communities and Ecology, Reframing Environmental Justice Around the Ilva Steel Plant in Taranto, Apulia, and is published in a book collection called Class Inequality and Community Development, edited by Mai Shaw and Marjorie Mayo, that came out in 2016 by Bristol University Press. The second is an article called Working Class Psychology and Union Politics, a Conceptual Topology, published by the journal Globalization in April 2018. These papers analyze the story of Taranto within a working class community ecology framework, intersecting scholarship in environmental justice, feminist political ecology, and labor studies. However, what I would like to do with the rest of my talk today is to experiment with an environmental humanities approach and with the power of fiction and storytelling as a tool for communicating complex concepts in more than rational ways, mobilizing intuition, emotion, and empathy. I will thus tell you the same story in a fictional form, or rather as a metaphorical tale. The tale reflects most of the key moments in the history of the relationship between Taranto and Ilva and describes the rising of working class environmentalism in the course of the past 15 years. It is a tough story, but it features a positive and forward-looking finale. I hope that you'll enjoy it, and I also look forward to receiving your feedback, especially on whether you think this tale adequately reflects the theoretical approach of working class psychology as outlined before. So here comes the tale. It's called Story of Taranto and Ilva, or I thought it was love, but it was a master. The history of Taranto and Ilva can be called in many ways, but not as a love story. In fact, it is the story of an abusive relationship, a story from which Taranto must free herself, and to do so, she must have the courage to call things by their name, not love, but abuse, violence, and death. Taranto is not a woman, but a land and a city. Ilva is not a man, but a system of power based on blackmail and subordination. Their relationship began in a past that seems far away, but that in the long life of Taranto has been just a moment. A moment that changed everything, though. When Ilva arrived on his powerful car, Taranto was happy. Ilva made her many promises, brought her presents, gave her as much money as she had never seen, made her feel important, desired. He told her that her moment had finally arrived, that she would never be alone again. In return, he asked her a lot, but Taranto was willing to give Ilva all of herself. She thought it was love, and that it would last forever. And she thought of the children who would be born of that relationship, how they would be happy, how they would not miss anything. Taranto knew that Ilva already had other relationships, Bagnoli, Piombino, Cornigliano. She was the fourth, but she would certainly be the favorite. And so it was. The others were gradually abandoned to their fate, but Taranto no. While the others stopped working for Ilva, Taranto was asked more and more, twice what she did before, twice as much as she had already given. It became increasingly clear that Ilva was not a lover, he was a master. He had entered her house and had made it his own. Taranto tried to ask for more, not for herself, but for her sons and daughters. She asked for more money for them, to give them a better future. But it soon became clear that this future belonged to Ilva anyway. The sons of Taranto had to work for Ilva, and the daughters of Taranto had to take care of them so that they could continue working for Ilva, generation after generation, until the end of time, or until Ilva was tired of Taranto. And if Taranto protested, Ilva threatened to leave, and she could not accept it. She was afraid of being left alone, of not making it to raise her children without him. But the worst was still to come out. At some point, Taranto realized that her children were not happy. Not only were they slaves, but they were getting sick, and also her daughters and their sons and daughters. And Taranto realized that she too was not well. Her blue sky was always red and gray. her sea more and more poisoned, and so were the animals and the plants, and the life inside her was getting sick. Taranto was increasingly tired. She had to fight with all her strength against illness and death, to continue giving life, and in the meantime she had to continue working for Ilva. But then she realized that Ilva was the cause of the disease. It was Ilva that dirtied anything, that poisoned, that killed. Ilva did not care for her, her children, their beautiful house. Ilva only wanted their work all for himself. Taranto then made a decision. She had to leave Ilva. She and her children no longer wanted to be his slaves. So they said, enough. Now we know who you really are. A system of power based on subordination, blackmail, fear, violence. We know that what you say is not true. It is not true that you want our good. It is not true that you will stop harming us. But above all, it is not true that we have no alternative. Our land is ours. Even if you have polluted it and made it sick, we can still save it and live here as free people. But you have to pay dearly for what you did. You have to pay up to the last penny for all that you have destroyed, ruined, soiled. We have our rights. The law is on our side. And if that is not enough, we will ask for other laws and we will ask that they be respected. And the children of Taranto said, we will stop working for you. Without us, you cannot do anything. It is we who give you the strength you have. So from now on, you will have to do what we say. You will work for us. We will stop dying for you, to see our land die and our children die for you. We will decide what to do, how to do it, and for how long. We will take back what is ours. We will make the sky blue again, and the land green again, and the water of the color of the sky. We will grow good and healthy food on our land. Our wages will be used to give life and not death. And then Taranto and her children called other lands and cities and said, let's join forces and fight against all the masters, against the blackmail. Let's build a new economy based on autonomy, solidarity, and justice. Let's fight for liberation. United we win. It will be a hard and long struggle, but we will succeed because we are many and we have the strength, the intelligence, the heart, and justice is on our side. Together, we will free ourselves from blackmail, abuse, and servitude, and we will build a new world for our children, a world that owes nothing to anyone. And when Ilva realized that they were really doing it, he said, I'm leaving. But this time, Taranto answered, go, we will not miss you, be sure. It will never happen, because without you, we will be just fine. Thank you.